There is a kind of silence that is louder than screaming. It is the silence of a woman who has decided she will no longer explain herself to people who were never listening in the first place. This is the story of Noorjahan Begum Noori, as her mother once called her, in a voice full of river water and marigolds. A woman who had survived 11 years of another family's house, who had cooked their feasts and swallowed their cruelties, who had embroidered their tablecloths and patched their silences. A woman who, on one particular Eid evening, in the umber warmth of a dining room hung with fairy lights and the smell of sewai and roasting meat, finally understood that some doors are not meant to be kept walking back through. She stood. She walked out. And the story, the real story, began precisely there in that doorway, with her back to the table and her face to the night. The Chaudhry house on Nazrul Lane in Sylhet was famous for three things. The climbing jasmine that had overtaken the eastern wall so completely that the plaster beneath could no longer remember what sunlight looked like. The brass gate with the broken latch that everybody knew about but nobody fixed, because fixing it would mean admitting it had been broken. And the mother, Amina Chaudhry, who had outlasted to daughters-in-law and one full renovation of the kitchen, and who moved through the house, like weather, unpredictable, total, and entirely convinced of her own necessity. Noori had entered this house at 22. She had come from Netrokona, from a family of modest teachers and immodest hopes. Her suitcase full of new salwar kameez and her heart full of the kind of optimism that only exists before you truly understand what you have married into. Her husband Rafiq Chaudhry was not a bad man. This was the thing that made it so difficult. A bad man would have been cleaner, something to name, to point at, to leave without apology. Rafiq was something harder. A gentle man who had never developed the spine that gentleness requires to survive. He loved Noori in the way one loves a well-made thing, admiring it from a distance, grateful it existed, careful not to disturb the household by defending it too loudly. He worked at the district tax office. He came home tired. He ate whatever was placed before him, complimented his mother's cooking even when it was Noori who had cooked it, and slept deeply and without apparent guilt. He was, in the architecture of his own life, a load-bearing wall that had quietly transferred all its weight onto someone else. Noori had learned the Chaudhry house the way one learns a new language, through immersion, through error, through the slow and humbling process of internalizing rules that no one wrote down because the people who enforced them preferred the power of leaving them unspoken. She learned that the good pressure cooker was not to be used for her cooking, only Amina's. She learned that the back bedroom window was hers, but the front bedroom window, the one that looked onto the jasmine and the lane, was not hers to open. She learned that her own opinions, if they were to exist at all, must be offered in the form of questions, and ideally questions that already contained the answer the family preferred. She learned to become useful without becoming seen. In the first year, people asked about children with the chirping patience of people who believed themselves to be making friendly conversation. By the third year, the asking had changed in texture. It had become probing, a little sharp, like a finger pressed against a bruise to see if it still hurt. By the sixth year, it was no longer a question. It had become a verdict, delivered in the passive voice so that no one in particular was responsible for it. It was decided, by means no one could trace back to any single person, that Noori was the problem. Rafiq had a younger brother, Tariq, who had married a girl named Shireen 3 years after Noori's own wedding. Shireen had produced a son within the first year and a daughter in the second, with the efficiency of someone who understood that this was the metric by which she would be evaluated and had resolved to excel at it. She was not unkind to Noori, exactly, but she had the particular unself-consciousness of someone who does not need to be cruel because the circumstances are already doing the cruelty for her. Amina Chaudhry had, over the years, developed an entire vocabulary for Noori's childlessness. It surfaced in religious framings, prayers offered up with theatrical sorrow, visits to shrines mentioned in Noori's presence as if casually, conversations about divine, that somehow always found their way back to the woman sitting at the edge of the room. It surfaced in medical insinuations, aunts who knew of doctors, cousins who had heard of treatments, remedies involving fenugreek and faith. What it never surfaced in was the possibility that the problem, if there was a problem, might not originate with Noori. Noori had long since stopped waiting for this thought to occur to anyone. She had also quietly, without telling anyone, stopped believing that children were the answer to the question being asked about her. She had begun to understand that the question was not really about children at all. It was about belonging, about whether she had earned her place, about whether the house would ever truly receive her. She had spent 11 years trying to answer a question that was never going to accept her answer. The night of Eidullah was thick with heat and ceremony. The house had been cleaned and re-cleaned. The floor tiles gleamed under the fans. The smell of Qurbani meat and spiced rice filled every room. Extra chairs had been brought from the neighbors. The children, Shireen's children, the grandchildren that existed, ran between legs in their new clothes, ribbons loosening, faces already sticky with shear. Noori had been cooking since 5 in the morning. She had made the polo. She had made the beef rejala, slow-cooked with yogurt and whole spices until the meat fell apart in the way that requires patience and attention and the willingness to stand over a stove for 2 hours in late morning heat. She had made the roasted hilsa, the dal, the 3 kinds of chutney. She had arranged the serving dishes. She had ironed the tablecloth. She had done all of this in the way she did everything in that house, thoroughly, without complaint, and without expectation that it would be attributed to her. The guests arrived in the late afternoon, Amina's sister from Maulvibzar and her husband, Rafiq's cousin Jalal, who spoke loudly about politics and more loudly about property, to elderly aunts whose names Noori had learned to say correctly, but whose faces still arranged themselves in her memory as categories rather than individuals. The one who pitied her, the one who disapproved. Dinner began. The conversation moved, as it always did in the Chaudhry house, through a series of predictable territories. The price of rice, the state of the roads, the achievements of Shireen's children, who were 4 and 7 and already apparently destined for remarkable things. Noori sat at the table and was quiet in the way she had perfected, present enough to be useful, small enough not to take up space that hadn't been offered. It was Jalal who said it. Jalal, who had drunk 3 glasses of sherbet and was in the expansive, performative mood that some men enter when surrounded by an audience they believe to be appreciating them. He said it the way people say things they have been thinking for a long time and have merely been waiting for the right theatrical moment to release. A broad gesture toward the table, a laugh that wasn't entirely a laugh, a glance toward Amina that was both seeking and bestowing permission. He said, "It's a shame, isn't it? All this beautiful cooking and no children to pass the recipes on to. A barren tree may give shade, but it gives nothing for the future." The table received this in the way tables receive such things. A half-second of stillness, then the small, self-protective adjustments of people who do not want to be associated with the discomfort they have just been made to feel. Shireen looked at her plate. Rafiq reached for more rice. The elderly aunts arranged their expressions into something between sympathy and the vindication of those who have long suspected this. Amina, to her credit or discredit, it was impossible now to say, did not correct him. Noori looked at Jalal. She looked at the table. She looked at her husband, who was examining his food with the careful attention of someone who has decided that the safest place to be, in this moment, is inside a plate of rejala. And she felt, with a clarity that was almost startling, that she was done. Not angry, not humiliated, or rather, she understood that the humiliation was real, but she had passed somehow beyond the stage where it required her to collapse or to explain herself or to look to her husband's face for rescue that was not coming. She was simply done. The way a river is done with a particular bank, not violently, not with protest, but with the quiet inevitability of water finding its own level. She put her fork down. She folded her napkin. She looked at Jalal once more and she smiled. The kind of smile that has nothing in it to offer and nothing in it to take back, a smile that is entirely for oneself. And she stood. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. She walked to the kitchen, collected her handbag from the hook by the back door, where it had hung every day for 11 years, and walked out into the street. The night smelled of roasting meat and distant rain. The jasmine on the eastern wall was blooming. She did not look back at it. She went to her sister's house. Her sister Cameroon lived in a second-floor flat in the old part of the city. the rooms always a little too full of her children's school books, and the good noise of a household that had never learned to be ashamed of itself. Kamrun opened the door and looked at her sister's face and did not ask questions. She made tea. She put a pillow on the sofa. She said, "Sleep. We'll talk in the morning if you want to, or we won't, but either way, sleep." Noori slept for 11 hours. It was the deepest sleep she had had in 11 years. In the morning, she drank her tea on Kamrun's small balcony and looked at the city waking up below her. The rickshaw bells, the first call to prayer still hanging in the air, a woman to balconies overhanging washing in the blue early light, and she felt something happening inside her that she did not immediately have words for. It was something like return. Like a part of herself that had been standing in a corner, patient and waiting, had been told it could come back into the room. Rafiq called 3 times. She did not answer the first 2. On the third, she picked up and listened, and what she heard in his voice was not the anger she had half expected, but something worse and more honest. Confusion. He genuinely did not understand. He said, "You embarrassed the whole family." He said, "What were people supposed to think?" He said, "Come home, Noori. This is not how things are done." She listened to all of it, and then she said, quietly and without particular drama, "I'm not coming back to that house, Rafiq. Not to live in it. Not the way I was living in it." There was a long silence on the line. She did not fill it. Noori had a degree. She had qualified as a school teacher before her marriage, and then the years in the Chaudhry house had consumed the years in which that qualification might have become a practice. But the degree still existed. The knowledge still existed. She had spent 11 years feeling like a person who was slowly disappearing, and now she discovered that she had not, in fact, disappeared. She had merely been made to stand very still. Kamrun's husband knew the principal of a girls' secondary school in Tilgad, a man named Harun who was famously practical and who believed, with the simple conviction of someone who had run an institution through several crises and come out the other side, that a good teacher was harder to find than a good building and should be acquired accordingly. The interview was brief. Harun asked Noori what she had been doing for 11 years. She told him. He nodded in the manner of a man who has heard this before and has learned not to let it become a reason. He offered her a position teaching Bengali literature to the class 8 and 9 girls, starting after the current term break. She said yes, before she had fully thought through the logistics, because she understood that the thinking through was the enemy of the yes, and she had spent too long letting the thinking through win. She rented a room. 2 rooms eventually, a small flat on a quiet lane where the mornings had a quality of light she had never experienced in the Chaudhry house, softer and more horizontal, coming through the window at an angle that made the dust look like it was floating rather than settling. She was 33 years old, and she was, for the first time in her adult life, living alone. And what she discovered about this was that it was neither as frightening nor as lonely as the stories had always suggested it would be. It was, mostly, very quiet. She found she liked the quiet, now that it was a quiet she had chosen. The class 8 girls at Tilgad Secondary were 13 and full teen and full of the precise combination of self-consciousness and recklessness that age produces. Loud when they thought they were invisible, subdued when they knew they were seen. They had been through 3 Bengali literature teachers in 2 years, each one departing for reasons the girls had privately diagnosed as some combination of fear and boredom. Noori walked into the classroom on her first day with a copy of Rabindranath's Chokher Bali and put it on the desk and looked at the room and said, without preamble, "This is a book about what happens to women who are not allowed to want things. We are going to read it, and we are going to talk about whether anything has changed. And I want you to tell me what you actually think, not what you think I want to hear. Is that agreeable?" The girls looked at one another. The girl in the second row, whose name was Rupa and who would go on to win 2 national essay prizes in the years that followed, said, "Most teachers say they want that and then don't." "I know," said Noori. "I'll probably sometimes do it too, without meaning to. Tell me when I do." It was an unusual thing to say to a class of 14-year-olds. It was, several of them would reflect many years later, the first time an adult had spoken to them as people whose perceptions were more useful than their compliance. Noori taught them literature the way she had learned to understand it, not as the performance of correct interpretations, but as a practice of recognition. She taught them to find in the old stories the architectures of the present, the ways in which women were written as problems to be solved, vessels to be filled, silences to be explained. She taught them to write back. She stayed late on Thursdays. She read their compositions on the bus home. She learned, slowly, the particular grammar of each of her students, which ones thought in images, which ones in arguments, which ones were protecting something, and which ones were ready to stop protecting it. She had not known she could do this. She had known she was intelligent. She had always known that, in the way that people who are intelligent but not permitted to use it still carry the knowledge of it, quietly, like a letter they have written but not yet sent. What she had not known was that she was good at teaching, that the work would produce in her a feeling she had no name for until Kamrun, watching her talk about a student one evening, said, "You look like yourself." Noori did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "I think I forgot what that felt like." The Chaudhry house on Nazrul Lane did not, as houses do not, collapse in the absence of the woman who had maintained it. It continued. The jasmine continued its climbing. The broken latch continued its not being fixed. Amina continued to move through it like weather. But absence, it turned out, was also a kind of presence. The cooking was different now. Shireen, who had never needed to become useful in the background because she had secured her position through other means, found herself unexpectedly responsible for quantities and timings she had previously only observed. The house, which had run quietly on Noori's invisible labor, now ran visibly and with more friction. It is not that anyone admitted this. Admitting it would have required acknowledging what had been taken for granted, and acknowledgement of that kind was not a language the Chaudhry house had developed. Rafiq had, in the early months, gone through the stages that such men go through. First anger, then a version of negotiation, then something that in a different man might have been called grief. He came to Kamrun's flat once and stood outside it in the manner of a person who is not certain what he has come to say. Kamrun told him Noori was not home, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of lie that a sister tells without compunction because some conversations, she had decided, could only happen when both parties had had enough time to become who they needed to be. Noori filed for khul, the right of a Muslim woman to seek divorce, in the winter of the year she left. The process was slow and required documentation and the patience of someone who has learned not to expect the world to make things easy. She had a lawyer, a compact and severe woman named Advocate Tanveera, who had heard Noori's account with the expressionless attention of someone cataloguing information and then said, "This is straightforward. Give me 3 months." It took 5, but it was done. The day the decree was finalized, Noori went home from the advocate's office and made herself tea and sat at her window in the horizontal morning light and felt something she had been waiting 11 years to feel. Not triumph, which is too sharp and too brief, but something more durable. The simple, solid sensation of being in her own life. There is a thing that must be said, because the folktale requires it, and because the truth requires it, and in this case they are the same. Noori was not, as it happened, unable to have children. She did not know this, had never had reason to know this with certainty. What she had known was that no child had come in 11 years of a marriage in which other things had also not come. Respect, genuine partnership, the sense of being received rather than merely accommodated. Whether the absence of children was physiological or simply the body's own wisdom about what kind of home it was being asked to bring life into. This is not a question. Noori spent time asking. It was not relevant to what she had done or to what she would do next. What she discovered over the years that followed her departure was that the thing she had been told she lacked was not the thing she had lacked at all. The children were the family's metaphor, not her failure. What she had actually been denied was voice agency, the ordinary right to take up the space she occupied. She wrote, in the 3rd year after leaving, an essay for a teacher's journal about literature and silence, about the ways in which certain stories teach girls that their hunger is a problem to be managed rather than a capacity to be developed. The essay was passed around. It reached people she had not imagined it would reach. She was invited to speak at a seminar in Dhaka, and she went, and she stood at a podium and was for 2 hours exactly the size she actually was. A woman came up to her afterward and said, "I left too, 3 years ago. I used to feel ashamed of it, but I don't anymore." Noori held her hand for a moment and said nothing, because sometimes the only honest response to being recognized is to recognize back. The Brahmaputra, the great river that runs through the valley country, brown and enormous and unhurried, the river that floods its banks every year without asking whether the banks are ready, has a quality that the people of the valley understand in their bones. It does not carry what is given to it. It carries what is released. There is a folktale, older than the telling of it, about a woman who went to the river with her grief and threw it in. Not to be rid of it. Grief is not a thing one can simply discard, but because the river was the one place large enough to hold it without making the woman feel that her grief was inappropriate or excessive, or the grief of someone who had brought things upon herself. The river took it. The river carries everything. The silt of the mountains and the ash of the dead and the prayers tied to banana leaves and set afloat on holy days and the grief of women who have been called barren trees and the ambitions of women who are learning, late, what they are capable of. Noori went to the river. Once, in the monsoon of the year after her divorce, when the water had risen to the edges of the ghats and the sky was the particular grey of a day that has fully committed to rain, she did not throw anything in. She sat on the wet stone steps and watched the water move. She thought about the dinner table, about Jalal's voice performing itself at her expense, about Rafiq's eyes fixed on his food, about Amina's silence, which had been its own kind of speech, about the 11 years of small accommodations, each one individually survivable, collectively a life she should not have had to survive. And she thought about the classroom, about Rupa's essay, turned in the previous week, about women in Rabindranath's poems who speak to the water, about the girl in the back row, Tahira, who had written a story about her grandmother for the school magazine and had come to Noori's desk with it held in both hands as if it might be dropped. She thought about the flat and the light in the morning and the tea she made for no one but herself and the slow unclenching of something that had been tight for so long she had forgotten it was supposed to be otherwise. The river moved, the rain fell. She sat until she was wet through, and then she stood, and she walked back the way she had come. People in the Chaudhry house spoke about that smile for years. It had, in the retelling, acquired the quality of a legend, something that could not quite be captured in the telling, only in the fact of its having occurred. Jalal, who was not a bad man but was not a careful one, and who had replayed the moment in his memory more than he would admit, said once that he had not understood it. She just smiled. What did that mean? No one who had been at the table could give him a satisfying answer, because the smile was not, in the end, a communication directed at them. It wasn't defiance, though there was something in it that resembled defiance the way a river resembles a flood. The same substance differently arranged. It was not forgiveness, which is a different thing and comes, if it comes, much later and in private. The smile meant, I am done performing devastation for your comfort. The smile meant, I know what I am, and it is not what you have called me. The smile meant, I have been waiting for this moment without knowing I was waiting, and now that it is here, I find I am ready. In the old tales of the valley, there is a figure who appears in many forms. Sometimes a river goddess, sometimes a woman in white at a crossroads, sometimes simply a very old woman. Whether or not Noori believed in such things, she would say, in the years that followed, that she had felt something like that at the table. Some internal nod, some acknowledgement from some part of herself. There is an old Bengali saying, the river does not carry the stone, the river carries what the stone releases. Noori Begum did not become a different woman the night she walked away from the Eid dinner table. She became more fully the woman she had always been, the woman who had cooked their feasts and read their silences and spent 11 years trying to become small enough to be safe. That woman was always going to stand up. She was always going to walk out. The only question was, which particular cruelty would finally be specific enough, public enough, unnecessary enough, to let her recognize what she already knew. A barren tree, Jalal had said, as if a woman's worth were fruit. As if the worth of a fruit were its capacity to be consumed by someone else. But a tree is also roots. A tree is also shade. A tree is also the thing that holds the earth together when the rains come. The thing that, when it is cut down, leaves an absence that only becomes legible years later when the hillside begins to give way. What the Chaudhry house lost the night Noori walked out of it, it did not understand it had lost. What Noori walked toward, she could not yet see. This is the nature of all departures that matter. We are never fully ready. we go anyway. Eid, putting down her fork and deciding that enough is enough, and that she is, in fact, enough, and that the life waiting for her on the other side of this door is hers, and she is going to go and live it.